Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. You'll be joining us for a conversation with Professor Sarah Young and Professor Julie Slux, both at Northwestern University. We'll be having a discussion with them about some of the work they've been doing that they'll be talking more in detail about later today for their scientific session. Their session is titled New Tools for Measuring, Monitoring, and Managing Water for Sustainable Development. My name is Louis Chang. I'll be interviewing them. I'm a PhD student at Northwestern University in Julius's lab. I'm a biologist, and I'm also very interested in science communication and science policy. And so this topic is of personal interest to me because I think it's this very interesting interdisciplinary intersection of the life sciences, meaning sociology and anthropology and economics, to really be able to address these societal issues and be able to communicate them with the public. So I find this topic very interesting, and hopefully you all will too. So to begin with, could you both introduce yourselves and tell us about your research?
Sure, my name is Sarah Young. I'm trained in nutrition and anthropology. I'm a professor in anthropology and global health at Northwestern University.
Hi, I'm Julius Lux, professor in chemical and biological engineering at Northwestern University, and also part of the Center for Synthetic Biology. And our research is really about how to bridge our understanding of how natural biology works and help make biology work for us and help us solve some global challenges.
So to start off with, your session focuses on water. Could you start by telling us why you think water is important and why we should all be caring about this and listening to your session?
So water is life. I mean, that's a platitude. It's a platitude because it's true. And one of the things that I've realized in the course of this work is water isn't just what we drink, or it isn't just what we produce food with. It touches every aspect of our life, and it shapes our happiness, it shapes our health, it shapes societal stability. And it's I don't know, water is life.
Yeah, from our perspective, we've become very interested in aspects of water quality. So there's many aspects of water. There's availability, quality, kind of household level issues that we'll talk about in a little bit. But from a quality perspective, it's an interesting thing because we all assume that our water is of high quality when we cook with it, when we consume, when we grow our plants and food with it. But that's not always the case. And it's a challenge because it's often hard for us to see, smell, or taste things that can be harmful for us. We're very interested in trying to develop new technologies that can empower individuals to be able to know if their water is of high quality.
So out of everything you could have studied for your research, why did you become interested in water specifically?
That's a great question. I mean, I said I was trained in anthropology and nutrition. I never said I was trained in water. But I was in the field. I had a big KO1 study in Western Kenya. And with my nutrition hat on, I was quantifying food insecurity. So that's not abject hunger, but that's experiences of problems with food. And then with my anthropologist hat on, I wanted to make sure I was asking the right questions. And so we did something called photo elicitation interviews, which is where we give cameras to people and ask them to take pictures of, and in this case, what shapes how you feed your baby. And we got pictures back of images of food insecurity as expected. Then we got all these pictures back of water. Water that was, people had to choose between buying clean water or buying food, leaving their children while they went to fetch water, violence in the household when there wasn't water around. And so by listening to participants, water came to me. Now, as it happens, Julius and I have a number of things in common, including marriage. And we were talking around the dinner table about our science. We do that when our girls aren't interrupting us. And I would say that might have shaped some of his thinking.
Yeah, so one of the major advantages of someone working in the global health arena is you hear about the major challenges facing the world every day. We had already been studying some of these natural processes that organisms use to detect if the water that surrounds them is contaminated. And some of the photographs that Sarah would talk about really put in stark contrast some of the things that people in the developing world were facing. Basic questions about water quality, whether they should go, walk a couple miles and wait in a long line to get water from a source that might be known to be clean, or if they have a source that's much closer to home but of questionable quality, they would often be making those decisions. We thought that some of the technologies that we could pivot our research towards could actually help these people make their daily decisions. So we moved to Northwestern a few years ago and really took the opportunity to launch a new direction for us where we're trying to transition our science and work with anthropologists and global health researchers to take this out into the world and try to inform solutions to some of these challenges.
Thank you. So I know in my personal experience, I've always been fortunate enough to have water when I need it, basically. And so this concept of water security, I think, is really interesting and something that I don't really have the experience to define for myself. So I wanted to ask you, how do you define water security in your work, and what are the major factors that govern this concept of water security?
Yeah, so water security can be used in lots of different ways. It can mean like a question of national security. It can mean water security for the larger ecosystem. And in our case, as an anthropologist and a social scientist, we really think about the household and the individual level. So I say water security as shorthand for household water security. And household water security depends not just on availability, although availability is necessary but not sufficient. You also need to be able to physically access that water, economically access that water, and then you need to be able to use that water for the suite of things that we use water for consumption and hygiene and production.
Thank you. So with that water quality that you're mentioning, what are issues that come up with it, and um, why is it so important at this moment? You know, like we've all grown up our entire lives needing water. So, and you know, it's historically also in the United States. For example, I can think of the Flint, Michigan crisis. Like we've all heard about this in the news, but why particularly now at this moment do you think water is becoming an issue that we should care about?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, as you go online, you look at any sort of news articles, there's more and more articles talking about the global challenges for water. I think this has always been an issue in the developing world, where water is just such a central resource and the infrastructure is not necessarily there, or it's being developed, so that's on people's minds. But in the developed world, we're starting to see more and more issues with aging infrastructure, mismanagement, you know, larger storms and floods causing water issues, even wildfires, something that we've investigated in our research. So there's a bigger public awareness. I also think as the population across the globe grows, you know, access to fresh water is going to be viewed as one of these major resources that are going to define cultures and governments and countries and so on and so forth. So now is the time, I think it's becoming more aware that water is one of the most precious resources we have.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, there's this saying that water is the new oil, but in fact, there is not a substitute for water like there is for oil. And I think another reason for the prominence of water these days, in addition to the great journalism that's happening to cover these water issues, is sustainable development goals. So there's one sustainable development goal that calls out water specifically, but it's not hard at all to see how water weaves into all 17 of them.
So, with all of these issues that you're talking about, what do you think is needed to address them?
Yeah, I think one of the major themes of the session and why we're here today is this concept of measurement. You know, you can't fix a problem that you can't quantify or know about. Because water is such a complex subject that touches many different levels of human experiences and sustainability and so on and so forth. This just means that there's many types of measurements that we need. I think one of our main points is it's not that there's no ways to do this now, it's just we need ways that are scalable, that are affordable, that can get us the data that we need to be able to make impactful decisions about how to manage these resources.
Yeah, and metrics that are kind of intuitive. I mean, there are many ways of measuring water right now. Hydrologists do a great job. We can use climate data to understand water patterns, and we can measure water really nicely in laboratories. But what we don't have is a more democratic way, like a way, I always use the analogy for your work, a pregnancy test for water, where you don't need any skills, or we call it the 5-year-old test at our house. Our 5-year-old can use these. So what I would like to do is to give the power of a simple indicator. So for my tool that we'll be talking about at 3:30 is a scale. It takes 3 minutes. It's 12 items, and with that score, you can predict a bunch of mental health and physical health outcomes. And this score, I mean, anthropologists are good at at doing a lot of description, and rich description is kind of what we do. But we also need to quantify so that we have these numbers for quick decision making and comparisons across settings. And so between the pregnancy test and the little number, we hopefully will be painting a picture of water security for the world.
So you mentioned quantifying these experiences. I imagine that between different cultures and taking this cultural relevancy into consideration, it's really hard to express these experiences through words. So when you mention quantifying, I can imagine how you need that to kind of compare between these different cultures. Could you explain more about that and why you think this quantification of this experience is so important?
Yeah, so it's a little bit painful to be reductionist. I mean, we like to give rich descriptions in social science. And so, but we also want to be communicating in efficient ways across policy making and across other disciplines. So what we did was we identified candidate items that we thought would hold these questions that would apply in places with drought and in places with excess water. There were 32 of them. And we did those in like 10 sites, and we looked at the statistics and we talked about them, how they held up. And we did another round in another 18 sites. And essentially what we did was we came down to 12 items that do hold up in any low or middle income setting. And so it's questions like, how often in the last 4 weeks were you worried about the water for your household? How often in the last 4 weeks did you go to sleep thirsty? So I think what we've done is reduce this concept of water insecurity into something that's countable and and answerable, so that we can then shape our understanding.
For those of you just joining now, we're having a discussion with Professor Sarah Young and Professor Julius Lux from Northwestern University, talking about how they have developed new tools for measuring, monitoring, and managing water for sustainable development. Professor Sarah Young just explained this new scale that she developed to quantify household water insecurity. And so my next question is, how is this scale, this method that you've developed, different from other ways to measure water insecurity?
Yeah. So, like I said, there are lots of ways of measuring water, and they're all interesting and useful and answer different kinds of questions. But like what we are measuring here is household water insecurity, and that means like access of water, experiences of access and use. So a lot of times, for example, infrastructure is built, and then we can count that now there are 5 wells, or now there's a dam, or now there's piping into 200 houses. But counting infrastructure isn't the same thing as appreciating how people's lives are shaped by that infrastructure or by that by the price change in water. So that's what we're trying to do, is capture at the individual household level.
So Julius, tell us more about the technologies your work is developing to address some of these issues of water insecurity.
Yeah, so I think Sarah used a really good analogy. Essentially, we want to try to make something as easy to use as a pregnancy test, but for water contaminants. So if you look at how water quality, and what I'm talking about is the purity of water and whether or not there's pathogenic or chemical contaminants in there. The ways that we currently use to measure that is through pretty sophisticated analytical chemistry instrumentation. So you got a big machine, takes some expertise to operate, it's expensive, and it's kind of centrally located. And that means it's just not easy or cost effective to make a lot of measurements, and it's certainly out of the realm of an individual being able to leverage that. So what we're trying to do is essentially shrink that instrumentation down so it's inside of a single test tube or on a single piece of paper, so that you just simply rehydrate it and you get a visual indication of whether or not a specific contaminant is present. The way that we're doing that is actually going back to nature and asking, well, how does natural biology do this? You know, microorganisms are constantly monitoring their environment all the time for water contaminants. They've got these little molecular machines that will sense these contaminants, and for the cell, they will then, trigger the expression of a gene or a protein that can then mitigate that. For example, pump the toxin out or degrade it. My lab has been really focused on trying to learn how these processes work, so then we can essentially repurpose them and use the tools of synthetic biology to make these new sensors.
Could you tell us a little more about this field of synthetic biology and give us a broad overview of where your work fits into this field?
Yeah, so synthetic biology, if you haven't heard of it, it's kind of a new field that's really trying to capture our knowledge of how natural biological systems work and use some of the principles and the diversity and the power of natural biological functions to help us solve problems in a sustainable way. I really like this water quality problem as a nice concrete example. So we already know that, for example, bacteria have got these molecular machines that sense water contaminants. What if we can, but we don't want to, play around with, releasing a bacteria into water. What we want is some simple test that's on a piece of paper. So let's extract those molecular machines, essentially rewire them. So rather than produce the protein that the natural bacteria would produce, make it produce a protein that can make a visible color, maybe fluorescence or a color change, so that when you rehydrate, the molecular machines activate and produce this nice visual color. So it takes an understanding of biology to be able to do that. What are those machines? It takes some biophysics, some computer science, and other engineering concepts to be able to put that together into a device that's cheap and easy to use.
So you've both talked about these tools that you've developed for addressing issues in water. You mentioned a scale that you developed. You mentioned these tools for testing contaminants in water. How do you think these new tools will help with these issues?
Tool development. Before I say what we'll do, I want to just take a step back to say how interesting the journey in this tool development has been. I mean, I told you about these 2 rounds of questions that we did. But what I didn't mention is how we've worked across disciplines. So we have anthropologists and geographers and physicians and epidemiologists and on the team. And there are people across the world and across time zones. We've worked together really nicely to come to some sort of consensus. And it's hard to get academics to come to consensus, but we've come to consensus on kind of these items. And so now the fun begins. So we are starting to roll out the scale in a lot of different settings. We've had it in some DHS sites, we've had it in some large clinical studies. And I'm really excited that we're now partnering in 2020 with UNESCO and the Gallup World Polls to implement the HY scale in all of Africa as well as in India, where we'll be oversampling such that we can talk about sort of data by state level in India. And so what I hope is that this quantification, this simple quantification, it takes only 3 minutes to ask. The scoring is arithmetic. It's very simple. Will help us to manage this thing that right now we aren't doing our best job at managing.
And I'll just build off that, and I would say we have kind of 4 major take-home messages about how some of these tools and the data that they can provide will help change the game on how water is thought of and managed. I think one of the first ones is education. We need to broadly educate society about how important these issues are and where the challenges are, and that can be. It's important to do this broadly because each region has their own kind of definition of a water issue. Some might have too much, some might have too little, some might be contaminated with one contaminant, and others might face another challenge. So really getting the public to think about water as this precious resource and educating them, I think, will go a long way. The second aspect of these tools we like to think of as empowerment. We really want to empower individuals to be able to take matters into their own hands, whether that's from making daily decisions about their water usage to making collective decisions, societal level decisions, demanding more from their governments to improve their quality of life. And the third, and specifically speaking about this meeting, is about the environment. Water is a resource that we need to treat very carefully and manage very carefully going forward because there is no replacement to it. It's how we all live and what we all need every day. And then I think a final point, on our 4 E's is the economic aspects of it. Water touches our daily lives in so many ways. And a lot of these there's economic impacts to some of these water issues, but there also may be economic solutions. And I think we all need to come to the table, the scientists and the global health and the broader society and people that think about economics. And so that's what we want to hope that these tools help deliver, that synergy.
So to impact all of these areas that you mentioned, which I think are very important, what else do you think is needed to make your tools more widespread so that people know about them and that people are using them to empower themselves?
Well, we sure are grateful to AAAS for giving us the forum today. I'm so glad to be collaborating also with a number of international agencies. So I mentioned UNESCO. The World Bank is also part of the panel that we're speaking at today. Paying attention to translate our p-values into something meaningful. We're trying hard, and so if the audience has any suggestions on how we could do a better job of that, we are all ears. Getting the word out in simple ways, yeah.
Yeah, I think for us on some of these technologies, we've got a lot of exciting developments in the lab, and now we need to transition that out and make it work in the world. You know, we are trying to work with anthropologists, environmental scientists to do field testing ourselves, but I think at this stage we really need those partnerships where people have an identified need for this information, so we can tailor the technology to meet their needs.
Before we wrap things up, does anyone in the audience have any questions that they'd like to ask? Okay. Yes. So to repeat the question was for this test to be able to use worldwide and across cultures, how are you working in order to translate these tests so that they can be applicable to multiple cultures?
Great question. I should mention the name of this scale. I'm not sure I have. It's the Household Water Insecurity Experiences Scale, HWISE for short, thought of by this man on a bike ride to school one morning. So the HWISE scale has been implemented in 28 sites, and for all of those sites, we have translated it into the appropriate local languages. Those are all available. It's validated for low and middle income countries, which is not to say that it isn't valid for high income countries, but it hasn't been validated for them. So I think right now we have the language and the scale in at least 20 languages. We also have a manual right here that's also available online that can guide you through the implementation and sort of the linguistic and cultural adaptation.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay. So, thank you. So the question was, are you working to develop any tools to diagnose or to test for pathogens in your drinking water as well?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Our research is focused on the chemical contaminants, but of major concern is pathogens. And in fact, synthetic biology is making great strides in this. This is not our work, but others in the field. The idea behind pathogen detection is that each pathogen has a unique kind of fingerprint in their genome, you know, the DNA that makes them the pathogen that they are. There's a bunch of molecular level tools that can essentially be programmed to identify a unique barcode for a pathogen and amplify that material and then create a visible signal. In fact, some of the most exciting developments in the field come from something called CRISPR, which people may have heard in terms of a genome engineering tool. But it can actually be used as a diagnostic tool. So CRISPR systems can go in and find the signatures for the barcode signatures for a pathogen and make these visible signals in the same way. And in fact, this is being commercialized now. There's two companies, one Mammoth Biosciences and the other one Sherlock Biosciences, doing just that. So it's a great question. I think those products may come to market pretty soon.
Thank you. Any last questions? Yes. So the question was, in low-income countries, what resources exist to support your tests?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of concerns for on day-to-day life in low-income countries besides water quality. I mean, that's just one of 100, right? And we've been thinking a lot about this. One of the ways to where we see this being used, if I can speak for you, where we see this being used is for large-scale monitoring. So, for example, the Joint Monitoring Program of United Nations, WHO, UNICEF, to use this for kind of seeing where for targeting purposes. That's where I see the first step, but maybe you have others.
It's a great question. Right now, we're exploring partnerships, and the answer is a little bit different everywhere you go. Even some larger countries like India have regular water monitoring programs that they do. They're just having issues with the scale that they can do that and the number of households they can actually touch. So that might be the most practical place to start until the cost can drop so that it's really not much of an ask for an individual. But that's a clear need for the technology development. Get it out there. Oh yeah, I can just, Sarah just asked a question about the cost. Right now at laboratory scale, these are kind of in the cents per test type thing. And so we're trying to find ways to make that even cheaper for these global health applications.
Thank you. So since we're running short on time to wrap things up, I just want to say in my past couple days experience at this meeting, I found that a huge reoccurring theme is that for scientists to do the work that they're doing and to be able to impact these communities, you have to bring in all of these different disciplines like the life sciences, anthropology, sociology, economics, take all of these into consideration and really be able to communicate it in an effective manner for people to listen and know that it's a resource they can use. And so I think this work is really interesting because it fits really well into this message. And so if any of you have any more questions and would like to hear more about Professor Sarah Young's or Professor Julius Lux's work, they'll be hosting their session at 3:30 later today titled New Tools for Measuring, Monitoring, and Managing Water for Sustainable Development. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Louis.